want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Ali for sending a few of Walker's fans up the road. I want to thank Dr. James Hart, the Chair of History, for coming, and of course Price for setting up the AV, and Valerie for setting up everything else. Now let me briefly, and I know he would rather have the time to talk, so I'll make it briefer than he deserves. Just let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Walker Robbins. Dr. Robbins got his BA at this university in 2007 in Film and Video Studies, his MA in 2010 from History on Jacob Gartenhausen, a very interesting figure in the Baptist missionary movement, and most recently his PhD on the dissertation Between Dixie and Zion, Southern Baptist Palestine Questions. Dr. Robbins has also taught widely for the department and the program of Judaic Studies. He's taught at Ali. He'll be teaching this summer the U.S. Survey, U.S. History Survey, which of course is history's biggest class and is not entrusted to just anybody. So not only has Walker really excelled in his scholarship, he's already published 3 or 4 articles, his teaching, his service for the department, actually for religious studies and the history department, as well as Judaic studies. It's fair to say that Walker, as he graduates, or officially graduated already? Done. Now that he has graduated and officially Dr. Robbins, he's not only compiled a career here, he's compiled a distinguished career, which is not a term you would use all that often for a graduate student, but he won last year a Provost Award for Best Undergraduate, Best Teaching by a Graduate Assistant, and he has just been awarded this very week the Provost's Award for Best Dissertation in the Humanities and Social Sciences. And they don't hand those out. That's it. With further ado,
thank you very much.
Colleague, Walker Robbins.
All right. I'm not checking my text messages. This is my timer since there are no clocks. I can find in this room how much time I have. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's great to see so many familiar faces from Ollie, making the walk up here to the regular campus. I want to thank Dr. Levinson for his introduction and for this opportunity and for so many other opportunities, especially this semester, and I have to thank Dr. Hart for that as well. Without them, I wouldn't be teaching, which I love to do. I'm really enjoying the class that I'm teaching this semester. But let's get to the topic at hand. Was Harry Truman a Christian Zionist? Now, before I get into that question, what I want to do, I want to do a little bit of background work with y'all. Specifically, I want to define a term that I'm going to be using again and again and again, and that is the Palestine question. So what was the Palestine question? As many of you are aware, during World War I, the British conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the region for almost exactly 400 years. And after the war, the League of Nations gave the British a mandate to administer the territory and to prepare it for eventual self-government. Now, in many ways, what the Palestine question was the question of what that future self-government would look like. Would it favor the Zionists, who wanted to establish a Jewish state and were immigrating in greater numbers every year? Would it favor the Palestinian Arabs, who were the majority of the population, who wanted Palestine to form either part of a larger Arab kingdom or an independent Palestinian Arab state? Or would it strike some sort of balance between these competing and perhaps contradictory interests? This, in many ways, was the Palestine question in a nutshell. So the British are going to rule Palestine for about 30 years and deal in varying ways with the Palestine question. But in 1947, they're going to decide to punt that question to the newly formed United Nations. And in November of 1947, the UN will pass a resolution calling for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state, an Arab state, with Jerusalem coming under international administration. Now, the U.S. and the Truman administration supported partition and worked to ensure its passage. The Zionists supported partition. The Arab states, though, and the Palestinian Arabs themselves were against it. Nevertheless, it passed, and the British set a date for withdrawal, May 14, 1948. Now, over the intervening months, fighting was going to break out in Palestine as the British prepared to withdraw, as the Zionists prepared to secure the borders of their future state, and as the Arabs worked to prevent the implementation of partition. And it gets increasingly violent as 1948 transitions from late winter into spring. So, I get thirsty. Now, as the situation grew more violent, it increasingly became a question of whether or not partition would be viable. Would this plan work? Nonetheless, the Zionists decided that they were going to press forward, they are going to proclaim their state when the British mandate ends. And so the question for the international community, the question for the U.S. government, the question for Harry Truman becomes, are we going to recognize this state as a legitimate state when it is proclaimed? Or are we going to try to implement some other plan in its place? Now, our State Department, the U.S. State Department, was against recognition. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were against recognition. Secretary of State George C. Marshall was against recognition. But there were several in Truman's administration who were for it, the Congress was for it, and the American public at large was in favor of recognition, it seems. So Truman had a real decision to make. Follow the State Department, follow his defense advisors, or follow the public opinion, or other factors. Now, on May 14, 1948, as you know, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed from the Tel Aviv Museum that at the midnight expiration of the British mandate, the Jewish state, named Israel, would come into being. And Harry Truman that day made his decision for sure at 6:11 p.m. Washington time, so that's 11 minutes after midnight in Palestine. He extended de facto recognition to Israel. And here you can see the document that is pasted together. Now, why did he do it? Why did he override the wishes of the State Department? Why did he override the wishes of George C. Marshall, the man he would later call the greatest living American, the reigning Time Man of the Year in 1948? Big deal. Why did he decide to override those concerns and recognize the Jewish state? This question has bugged scholars pretty much ever since Truman made the decision. And historians have offered, for the most part, two explanations. The first is that Truman acted out of narrow political interests. That 1948 was an election year, he wanted to secure the Jewish vote in New York, and so he recognized the Jewish state, hoping to get some electoral results from that. The other explanation, oh, by the way, and that's what George Marshall believed at the time, that Truman had acted out of political interest.
Could you speak up, please?
I'll try. Now, the other explanation is that Truman acted out of humanitarian concern for the Jewish refugees in Europe after World War II and after the Holocaust. Basically, the argument is that his concern for Jewish refugees put into motion a logic whereby eventually supporting partition and supporting the recognition of the Jewish state made the most sense in terms of solving this refugee problem. Politics or humanitarianism? Now, 30 years later, in 1978, a symposium was held at the Harry Truman Research Institute at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And scholars and statesmen from the U.S. and Israel came to visit, exchange papers, and symposium stuff. Now, among those in attendance was a guy named Moshe Davis, who was a great scholar from Jewish Theological Seminary, and later from Hebrew U itself. He wasn't there to share a paper, though, really, but to share some anecdotes. Specifically, he shared a story from meeting Truman in 1953. shortly after he left office. Truman had been brought to JTS to meet with some Jewish scholars, including Moshe Davis, and he'd been escorted there by his longtime friend, Eddie Jacobson. And according to Davis, at this meeting, as Jacobson introduced Truman, he introduced him as the man who helped create the state of Israel. And apparently, Truman turned to his friend when he said that and said, "What do you mean, helped create? I am Cyrus. I am Cyrus." Evoking, of course, Cyrus the Great, the 6th century BCE Persian ruler, who is lauded in the Bible for allowing the exiled Judeans to return to their homeland and reestablish their life there. Davis shared another anecdote. This one had been circulated by Eliyahu Eilat, who had served as the first Israeli ambassador to the U.S. And Eilat, in the spring of 1949, had escorted Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, to come meet Truman. About a year after Truman had made his decision, about 4 years before the meeting at JTS. And according to Eilat, according to Davis, at this meeting, Rabbi Herzog had drawn the parallel between Cyrus and Truman, and had told the president that the reason that God had put him in his mother's womb was so that one day, he would, my phone's on. One day he would help God's chosen people in their time of greatest need. And apparently, at this, Truman had grown really emotional. He stood from his chair and with tears listening in his eyes asked the rabbi if indeed this was true, if indeed his actions were to be interpreted thusly. And the rabbi said, "You betcha." Now, Moshe Davis followed up these anecdotes with a question to his audience. He asked, when did Truman's biblical Israel consciousness begin? Was it this meeting with Rabbi Herzog? Was it something he'd come to through a mature reading of the Bible as an adult? Or was it something that had been ingrained in him as a child? Now, since then, since 1978, a number of scholars have taken Moshe Davis's questions seriously and explored the idea of whether or not Truman's religious background in some way contributed to his recognition of the Jewish state and the whole series of decisions that he made leading up to it. Foremost among these have been these guys. Over here, this is Michael Benson's 1997 book, Harry Truman and the Founding of Israel. In the middle, you have a book by Paul Merkley, who's a scholar of Christian Zionism and is actually a Christian Zionist himself, who's devoted a chapter in 2 of his books to Truman and his faith and the recognition of Israel. And here, this is the most recent book, Religion in the Oval Office, published by Gary Smith last year with Oxford University Press, which is basically a collection of religious biographies of various U.S. presidents, and includes a section on the role that Truman's faith played in his recognition of Israel. And these scholars have argued that yes, indeed, Truman's Christian upbringing contributed to his decision-making and predisposed him in varying ways towards support for Zionism. And to just give this argument in a nutshell, this is from Gary Smith last year. Refusing to take the politically expedient route, Truman, guided by his Christian faith and humanitarian instincts and willing to make tough decisions, granted diplomatic recognition to Israel. Now I'm going to return to this general idea about whether Truman's religion affected his decision-making. But my focus today is on some more specific claims that these same scholars have made. Benson, for instance, this is not the major claim in his book, but other people have cited it, and it is an argument that he makes, has argued that Truman was a student of and believer in the Bible and the Old Testament promises to the Jewish people. So he believed that the Bible indicated that God had promised the land of Israel to the Jewish people, and that they would collect on that promise at some point in the future. A pretty significant argument. Gary Smith, who depends a lot on Benson in his profile of Truman from last year, has argued basically the same thing, with a few additions that I'll go over later in the talk. Paul Merkley, for his part, has argued that Truman modeled himself on Cyrus, deliberately modeled himself on Cyrus. That when he said, I am Cyrus, he was being quite serious when he did so. Now these claims have started to proliferate in the Historiography. And just as an example of this, so probably the most comprehensive account of Truman's decision-making from 1945 to 1948 is Allison Ronald Radish's A Safe Haven, which was published in 2009. And they mention towards the end of the book that biblical prophecy for Truman lent a stamp of approval from a higher authority to the decision to recognize Israel. And you've had other scholars citing Benson, citing Merkley, and I'm sure in the future who will cite Smith, suggesting that Truman was a Christian Zionist, that he somehow believed Zionism was a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, that the land had been promised to the Jewish people. Now you've had other scholars who have dismissed this altogether, but no one has evaluated these specific claims on their own terms. And so this is what I want to do today. When I ask, was Harry Truman a Christian Zionist? This is what I'm asking. I'm asking, did he believe that the Bible indicated the land had been promised to Jewish people and that they would collect on the promise? Did he believe that the Zionist movement was in any sense a fulfillment of prophecy? And did he believe that he was somehow a Latter-day Cyrus, that he was participating in a biblical drama? Those are the questions I seek to answer today. And to just give a preview, I don't believe he did on any of those counts. Now, before we get there, I do want to do a little bit of background on Harry Truman's religious upbringing. Just have water, right? You get a present. So Truman was born in 1884 in rural Missouri to two Southern Baptist parents. At the age of 6, though, when he was 6, the family moved to Independence, Missouri, and he was enrolled in a Presbyterian Sunday school. And he'd attend the Presbyterian church throughout his youth. While in Independence also, he liked to visit the local library and read all the time. He liked to read history books, he liked to read stories about the great heroes from the past, and he liked to read the Bible. It had large type, and he needed that. Depending on what interview you read with Truman, he read the Bible anywhere from 2 to 15 times all the way through by the time he was 15 years old. Now, whatever the number, he loved the Bible, he knew it well, and had read it many times as a youth. He was familiar with its stories and its characters, and so on. Now, at the age of 18, Truman moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and was baptized into the Benton Boulevard Baptist Church. So he chose to be a Southern Baptist. Shortly thereafter, he moved back to Grandview to work at the family farm, Grandview, Missouri, and he transferred his membership to the Grandview Baptist Church. This is a later iteration of that church you can see here. And he would keep his membership there throughout his life. So he'd remain a Southern Baptist throughout his life. And I know many of you are probably thinking, well, he's a Southern Baptist, of course he's going to support the creation of Israel. Baptists love Israel. Well, in the early 20th century, Baptists had a lot of different approaches to the Jewish people in terms of understanding the Jewish people, and in terms of understanding the land of Israel. So it was no guarantee that a Southern Baptist would support Zionism or would support the creation of Israel. And if you don't believe me, there's a thick dissertation you can read in the library. It's prize-winning, too. Besides that, Truman was an independent thinker when it came to matters of religion. He had a lot of beliefs that didn't exactly jive with typical Southern Baptist beliefs in the early 20th century. So what were these beliefs? Well, we have some sources that we can use to draw them out. Starting in the 19-teens, he wrote love letters to his future wife, Bess. Of course, those are going to continue throughout his life. These love letters happen to mention religion, like all good love letters do. When he gets into office, of course, he's giving speeches at churches and to religious groups where he'll discuss matters of religion. He'll write notes to himself in his diary or on scrap pieces of paper. These are now archived at the Truman Library. And of course, when he's president, he's going to give a lot of interviews, and after the fact, and he's going to write memoirs. So there's a decent amount of sources in trying to recapture President Truman's thinking when it came to religion. And I think there are three main themes that carry on throughout his life. So from these letters in the 19-teens, on through his presidency in the 1940s and the early 1950s, and after his presidency into the 1960s. The first and most important is that Truman believed morality was the essence of religion. That religion should get people to act right. Here you can see this in a quote in a letter to Bess from 1911. "I am by religion like everything else. I think there is more in acting than in talking." This would stick with him throughout his career. You can see it in the 19-teens, you can see it in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. He believes religion should get people to act better. And he doesn't concern himself with doctrine, the talking that he mentions right here, for the most part. Religion is about making moral people or making a moral country. This is the argument he'll make when he's president, of course. So morality is very important. It's sort of a Jeffersonian belief that morality is the essence of religion. And according to one of his biographers, he was actually a fan of Thomas Jefferson's The Life and Moral Teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, which famously, retold the Gospels with the supernatural stuff snipped out. According to one of his biographers, Truman liked that book, and Jefferson was one of Truman's heroes. The second major theme is democracy. He had a very democratic faith. He disliked religious formalism, and he distrusted religious authority. You can see this in the 19-teens, you can see it in the 40s, in the 50s, and the 60s, throughout his life. Probably the quote that cuts to the heart of this aspect of Truman's religion, and it's a quote that you'll see in any book that touches on Truman's religion at all, is this one. And you can see it ties together his emphasis on morality with his democracy. "I've always believed that religion is something to live by and not to talk about. I'm a Baptist because I think that sect gives the common man the shortest and most direct approach to God." Again, he's going to reiterate this point throughout his life. Religion is about morality. It's about an individual's relationship with God. Third, Truman had what I call a Christian folk ecumenicism. I say folk because it's something he came to not through some sort of theological pondering, but just through exposure to people of different faiths and different backgrounds. He believed everyone, in some sense, was basically all right. You can see this in a letter he wrote Bess in 1918 from France during World War I. "I believe in all churches, even the Roman Catholic can do a man a lot of good." He didn't have a lot of Southern Baptists saying that in 1918. Y'all know, you know. "I had a Presbyterian bringing up, a Baptist education, and Episcopal leanings, so I reckon I ought to get to heaven somehow." Don't you think so? He'll reiterate this again throughout his life. And actually, by the time he becomes president, and when he's dealing with the Cold War, he'll actively work to build an international interfaith coalition against communism. So his ecumenicism will take on practical policy consequences when he becomes president. This is something it really was embedded deeply in him. After he died, a note he'd written to himself was found in his desk. I think he died in 1972 maybe. And a note was found where he'd said something like, "Jews, Mohammedans," he used the archaic term, "Hindus and Buddhists all believe in the same God that the Christians say that they do." So he really felt this ecumenicism deeply. So morality, democracy, ecumenicism. These are three themes that carry on throughout Harry Truman's life. One other thing I want to mention before we get into religion and the Palestine question is Truman's approach to the Bible, which he read anywhere between 2 and 15 times. Now, Truman loved the Bible, he knew it well, he quoted from it frequently. But how did he interpret it? Knowing the Bible, being familiar with it is not enough. People have particular interpretations of it. What did he seek from the Bible? What did he get out of it? First and foremost, Truman got moral instruction out of the Bible. Of course, this is the heart of his religion. His favorite verses, his favorite passage was the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. His other favorite passages were the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments from the Hebrew Scriptures. So his favorite verses dealt with moral instruction. This is the primary way in which he interrogated the Bible. He even at one point when he was president, he's asked in a press conference about the cornerstone of his political philosophy or something like that. And he would cite the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus. Very important. Secondly, the Bible to Truman was a source for history. He loved the stories, he loved the figures in it, and he considered it a good resource on the history of the region. And third, he considered the Bible a source of great beauty, of literary beauty. You can see this here in this interview he conducted with his biographer, William Hillman, in the early 1950s, where he describes the beauty of the Psalms, including the Zionist Psalm, Psalm 137, He says they're just so beautiful, they are just like poetry. Of course they are. So Truman, he looked to the Bible for moral instruction, for wisdom, for history, and for beauty. These are the ways that he approached it. Now, there's nothing really to suggest in this general overview that Truman would have a particular approach to the Jewish people besides believing, that they're probably all right in terms of their religion, or to the land of Israel itself. There's no suggestion that he believed biblical prophecy was something that pointed towards the future. Yet historians have made some claims otherwise, and it's distinctly possible that Truman believed specific things about Jews or about the land of Israel that ran in contrast to his broader emphases. That he had contradictory ideas in his head, as people do sometimes. Another possibility, of course, is that his exposure to the Palestine question while in office changed his mind, that he started to view Jews in the land of Israel in this particular way. So, these claims that I mentioned earlier are worth examining on their own. The first one I want to look at is the claim that Truman believed in the biblical promises to the Jewish people. In other words, that he believed the Bible showed that God had promised the land to the Jewish people and that they would come to possess it at some point in the future. Did he take this seriously? So scholars who make this argument, their primary source are the recollections of Clark Clifford. And Clifford's actually a great source if you want to understand Truman and his approach to the Palestine question. He was Truman's counsel from 1946 to 1948. By the spring of 1948, he's basically Truman's point man on the Palestine question. When Truman's deliberating whether he's going to recognize Israel or not, it's Clifford he gives the task of presenting the case for recognition. So he's a great source, he's right there, he's a great dresser, a lot of factors are working in his favor. And here's what he said. Truman contended that the Old Testament had made a commitment to these people that someday they would come into their right and someday they would have a homeland of their own. He would refer from time to time to Isaiah, and he would refer to other prophets and all their views and their commitments. He said that to Congress. Another quote from his memoirs. From his reading of the Old Testament, Truman felt the Jews derived a legitimate historical right to Palestine, and he sometimes cited such biblical lines as Deuteronomy 1:8, "Behold, I have given up the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land which the Lord hath sworn unto your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." And you're seeing that, you're saying, well, Clifford's a great source. He's in there, he's having these conversations, and he's saying Truman believes these things about the Bible. So what's your problem, Walker? One of my problems is that these come from a relatively late date. This first passage comes from an address to Congress in 1984, so 36 years after the fact. This second passage comes from his memoirs, which were published, or they're probably put together. They were published in 1991, they're probably put together in the late 1980s. So they're about 40 years after the fact. The other thing is that Clifford's not exactly consistent on what he means in terms of explaining Truman's approach to the Bible. Here he says very specifically, Truman bought into these biblical promises. And here he makes a more general claim that the Old Testament showed that the Jews had a legitimate historical right. So that's slightly different. Relatedly, in his earliest account of the run-up to the decision to recognize, Clifford said this is from 1977, "As a student of the Bible, Truman believed in the historic justification for a Jewish homeland." Now, belief in historic justification can suggest a very different thing than a belief that the Bible has promised the land to the Jewish people and that they'll come and collect on that promise. It reflects, to me rather, a recognition of the millennia-long Jewish connection to the land. In other words, the Zionist case that this is a return to the Jewish homeland made sense. It's historically justified. Okay, we'll come back to this in a second. Another source that scholars have cited, that Gary Smith has cited, and that the Ravashes have cited, is Alfred Lilienthal, who was a lawyer with the State Department in the mid-1940s, and later worked with the anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism. And Lilienthal has said the following: "Truman was a biblical fundamentalist who constantly pointed to the Old Testament. And there he quotes from Deuteronomy 1:8, the way that Art Clifford did in his memoirs. My problem with this, well, there are a few problems. First off, whoa, 1999. So that comes from a full half century after the events that Lilienthal is describing. And this is why Benson doesn't reference Lilienthal, because his recollections came after Benson published his book. Besides that, Lilienthal published a lot of stuff on the U.S. and Israel throughout his lifetime, starting in the 1950s. And in these books, he dwelt in detail on Truman's motivations for recognizing the Jewish state. He also, in these books, dwells in detail on Christian support for the Jewish state. Yet nowhere in any of these books does Lilienthal draw any sort of connection between Truman's reading of biblical prophecy and his decision to recognize Israel in any of these books throughout his career. So what does that tell us? Lilienthal read Clifford's memoirs, and they augmented his memory, and so he remembers in 1999 that Truman was a biblical fundamentalist who quoted Deuteronomy in support of his policy. And it's the same passage that Clifford quoted. That's the one that Lilienthal references in 1999. So really, in scholars making these claims, all roads point to Clark Clifford. And specifically, they point to this quote from 1984. That's the only place where he explicitly says that Truman somehow believed that the Bible indicated, God had promised the land to the Jewish people. Now, it's possible still that Clifford recalled this accurately, but historians have offered no contemporary corroborating evidence for these claims that Truman interpreted the Bible in this way at all. In fact, if you look at some of his quotes from the 1940s and 1950s, you can make the argument that he believed quite different things about the Bible. So here, this is from a note he wrote to himself after getting out of church in 1945. The Jews claimed God Almighty picked them out for special privilege. Well, I'm sure he had better judgment. The fact is, I never thought God picked any favorites. One wonders what the sermon was about. But here he's contesting the very idea of Jewish chosenness. And if the Jews aren't the chosen people, well, why is God running around promising land to people that he hasn't chosen? He could argue. Another quote, this is Truman describing how he understands the prophets to William Hillman in 1952. The prophets were the protagonists of the common man, and that is the reason they survived, and for no other reason. He viewed the prophets as people who spoke up for the common man, who gave moral instruction to Jews, to Christians, to the ancient Israelites. They didn't necessarily predict the future. So, based on that argument, I think the Clifford evidence is relatively weak. It doesn't line up with how we know Truman interpreted the Bible, or what we know about how Truman interpreted the Bible. And so I think the argument that's based on it, that Truman believed these biblical promises were active somehow, and that he was helping to fulfill them perhaps, have to be understood as questionable at best. Another claim that Gary Smith has made recently, last year in his book, is that Truman was influenced by the notorious fundamentalist pastor from Fort Worth, Texas, J. Frank Norris. Now, Norris was a Christian Zionist. He believed that God had promised the land to the Jewish people. He believed the Zionist movement was a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And he also argued from international law that the Jews had a right to the land by virtue of international law. Now, the evidence that Smith cites in suggesting that Norris had an influence over Truman is a letter that Norris wrote to Truman. And in that letter, Norris mentions that Matthew Connolly, who was Truman's appointments secretary in the late 1940s, had written to Norris asking for his position on the Palestine question. And so Norris had penned a letter several pages long, laying out his case from the Bible and from international law, that Truman should be supportive of the Zionist movement. This is October of 1947, if I didn't mention that. Now, Truman replied to this letter. He wrote Norris back, and Smith cites this letter, cites Truman's reply, in suggesting that Norris had influenced the president in some respect. Now, Norris was very proud of this reply, and he published it in a book, and he published it in his paper, The Fundamentalist, out of Fort Worth. And so we have a copy of it. And you can tell me, let's read the whole thing together, and you can tell me whether you think it shows that Truman was influenced by it. Dear Dr. Norris, I'm most grateful for your thoughtful letter of October 2nd. I deeply appreciate having the benefit of this expression of your views because I know that you have given long and extensive study to the Jewish-Palestinian question. Very sincerely yours, Harry Truman. Yeah, I mean, you can tell. I think maybe Frank Norris's mother, and I guess Gary Smith think this shows that Truman was influenced by Frank Norris. So I think unless there's some sort of corroborating evidence shows up, we have to dismiss this idea that he was influenced by Frank Norris. Now finally, I'm Cyrus. Paul Merkley's argument that Truman really modeled himself on Cyrus the Great. This is, here I want to specifically focus on what Merkley says, so I want to read these quotes as they appear in two of his books. So this is after mentioning the episode where Truman says, I'm Cyrus. These words of Truman's, I'm Cyrus, were uttered neither casually nor ironically. We must take them with the fullest seriousness, and when we do, we will have the key to understanding Truman's constant pro-Zionism. From American President's Religion in Israel a few years later, Truman pondered resolutely on the extraordinary circumstances that had made him president. He studied soberly his own strengths and weaknesses, and he came to the perfectly calm conclusion that he was Cyrus. It was not a manner of speaking, but the largest possible sort of truth, that someone, someday, would be called upon to play the role of Cyrus on behalf of the whole generation of Jews in their time of greatest need. Now, the problem here is that there's simply no evidence that Truman underwent this process of prophetic self-reflection that Merkley describes here. Everything that he's narrating is basically midrash. It's him writing that in and exploring Truman's mind, potentially. Nowhere else did Truman explain what he meant by saying, I'm Cyrus. He only mentioned this a couple of times. He mentioned it to Moshe Davis, and apparently later, meeting with Eliyahu Eilat, he brought it up again. So he only mentioned it selectively to certain Jewish and Israeli audiences. But in other sources, he never mentions it. He makes this parallel in his interviews and his memoirs, even when he brings up the Bible in terms of discussing the Palestine question. There's simply no evidence that he went through this process. And there's no evidence that this statement was uttered neither casually nor ironically. And this is actually what I believe, that Truman, when he met with these scholars at JTS in 1953, that he was joking. It wasn't, I'm Cyrus. It was, I'm Cyrus. That sort of thing. I've got to admit, I have the same amount of evidence for my argument that Merkley has for his. Really, all we have is this quote to go on. One other thing I'd like to mention is that in this first quote, he says, we must take Truman's words with the fullest seriousness, and when we do, we will have the key to understanding Truman's constant pro-Zionism. So if you understand I'm Cyrus, you can understand his constant pro-Zionism. The problem is Truman was not constantly pro-Zionist at all. At several different points, he was willing to support policy proposals that stopped well short of Jewish sovereignty. And so, on its own, this process that Merkley describes, there's no real evidence for it. And then the policy position that it's supposed to explain, Truman really didn't have it. He was not constantly pro-Zionist. He ended up there in the end, but he was absolutely not constantly pro-Zionist. Now, how did, come to the end, I'm doing good talk on time, I'm doing pretty good. How did Truman's religion shape his approach to the Palestine question? How did his reading of the Bible perhaps influence his approach? I think that early quote from Clark Clifford mentioning that the Bible led Truman to believe in the historic justification for the creation of a Jewish state is probably somewhere closest to the truth. Even though it came from decades later, it jives with what we know about how Truman interpreted the Bible. He looked to it as a source for history. In his interviews where he does bring up the Bible in the context of discussing the Palestine question, he mentions it in terms of historical interest. This is also, by the way, what Eliyahu Eilat, remember the first Israeli ambassador to the U.S., this is what he thought about Truman, that the Bible provided him with a historical familiarity with the reader. And so basically, Truman's understanding of the Bible, he believed that it showed the Jewish connection to the land. So the Zionist argument made sense. I do think that factored into his decision making. The other thing, and probably the most important thing, is that I do think that Truman's sense of moral duty, which was to him the essence of his religious faith, did shape his approach to the Palestine question. In terms of the refugee crisis in Europe, we have hundreds of thousands of Jewish displaced persons after the war. He expressed, while a senator in 1943, outrage at what was happening to the Jews in Europe. When he comes into the presidency, again and again and again, he's going to note the United States' moral obligation and the world's moral obligation to help the Jewish people. Besides that, this is how Truman himself explains his motivations in his memoirs, which were written in the early 1950s, by the way. He cites his moral concern for the Jewish people. And also, this explains the policy positions that he did have. The only consistent aspect of Truman's Palestine policy from 1945 to 1948 is his concern for the refugees. Starting in the late summer of 1945, he calls on the British, after receiving a report from Earl Harrison, a famous report on the DP camps. He calls on the British to allow 100,000 refugees into Palestine. And he'll reiterate that call again and again and again over the next several years. The British hate him for it. They're really angry about it. This is the only consistent aspect of his policy. In terms of a final settlement to the Palestine question, he was willing to entertain all sorts of different policy proposals, but he was uncompromising on the matter of refugees. So it fits with his religion, what we know about his religion. It's how he explained his actions himself, and it does help to explain the policy choices that he did make. Now, there's one other thing I want to cite in terms of evidence, and that is a letter. It's not from Truman himself, but it's a letter to Truman from Chaim Weizmann. Now, Weizmann wrote Truman in April of 1948 as the question of whether the U.S. would recognize the future Jewish state was very much in doubt. Now, Weizmann was a great Zionist statesman. He'd be the first president of Israel. And he was known for being able to pitch Zionism to non-Jewish audiences. He could sell it. And he knew when to weave in biblical languages that would draw in Christians. He knew how to do that. He knew how to pitch Zionism. And he knew his man. He knew Truman. And so it's interesting to me that in this letter he makes no reference to the Bible. But this is how it puts it to Truman. The choice for our people, Mr. President, is between statehood and extermination. History and Providence have placed this issue in your hands, and I am confident that you will yet decide it in the spirit of the moral law. I think that Weizmann, in making this appeal, cut to the heart of Truman's own faith. Now, was Harry Truman a Christian Zionist? I do not think so. But I do believe that the following month, the month after he received this letter, May 14, 1948, when he made his decision to recognize Israel, he did so indeed believing he was acting in the spirit of the moral law. Thank you.